So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. We do have 6 speakers in total. We're hoping the last one is a bit delayed, so we're hoping he'll make it in time to present to us as well. But to start off with, I'm going to do a quick introduction to what a biosphere reserve is, and then we'll go to Breda Moriarty from the Law Pro office, who's our local water catchment officer. And then we'll hear from Fran Igo, who is also with the Law Pro office, and he's going to share his knowledge on Arctic char. And followed by Stephen O'Shea from the Pearl Mussel project, who will share some of the work that they're doing with local farmers on protecting the pearl mussel species. And then we'll have a chat with John Quinlan about his experiences in fishing and guiding fishing as well. So I will start sharing my screen, again with my lovely, very colourful presentation. Now, is that sharing okay for everyone? Excellent. So thank you for joining us. As I said, my name is, am I going backwards? My name is Eleanor Turner, and I'm the Biosphere Officer working with South Cary Development Partnership on the Cary UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Now, the Biosphere Reserve is managed in partnership between South Cary Development Partnership, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Cary County Council. So what is a Biosphere Reserve? So it's a UNESCO designation, and they're areas that are internationally recognized for their biodiversity value and yet also actively manage to promote a balanced relationship between people and nature. So if you look on the UNESCO website, it will say they are learning places for sustainable development. So a lot of the goals of biosphere reserves are linked into the sustainable development goals as well. So they operate across 3 different pillars. We have nature conservation, sustainable economic development of the area, and research and learning. And we like to say they're places where nature and culture connect. Now, this little picture on the side shows the 3 different zones, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the map of the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. So this is a program that's been going on since 1971, when UNESCO developed the Man in the Biosphere program. Now we have 714 biospheres globally that span a surface of 6,812,000 kilometers squared. I almost couldn't read the number there, across 129 different countries. But in Ireland, we actually have 2 biosphere reserves. So we have the Kerry Biosphere Reserve here in the southwest, and we also have the Dublin Bay Biosphere Reserve over on the east coast. So again, what do we do? So we focus on nature conservation, which is one of the main elements of the work that we do. As sustainable development, which is about engaging with communities that live in the area and outside of the area and how to use the place in an environmentally sustainable way. And we also focus on research and learning. So this is part of our learning program here, where we deliver webinars. Of course, with COVID, we've done a lot of webinars. So hopefully now we're moving out of COVID, we'll be doing a little bit more in-person education as well. And we support a lot of research. So here is a map of the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. So the red area in the center was actually the first area that was designated as a biosphere reserve. So we've had a reserve in Cary since 1982, where Clariny National Park was first designated by the UNESCO Man in the Biosphere program. Now, as the program evolved, the criteria changed for what constituted a biosphere reserve, and that required an increase in the area. So in 2017, after a review process, we increased the area and changed the name. So it was originally called the Clariny National Park Biosphere Reserve, and now it's known as the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. And the areas that you see in orange and green on this map here are the areas that were added at that stage to what the Biosphere Reserve was. So we have a buffer zone, which includes areas of the McGillicuddy Reeks and over to the Paps Mountain Range in the east. And then the transition area, which is the green areas around that, which is where we see a lot of the human activity in villages and towns and things like that. So I'm going to stop telling you about biosphere reserves now, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what's going on inside the biosphere reserve. And I'm going to hand over to Breda. So thank you so much for joining us, Breda.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. Okay, I'll just start to share my presentation there. Now, that's coming up for you, right?
Yep.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Just in case. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here to talk about the waters of the Kerry Biosphere. My name is Breda Moriarty and I'm the Community Water Officer for Cary, and I work on the Local Authority Waters Programme. Just a brief overview of what I'll touch tonight on in the presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about the Local Authority Waters Programme, LAWPRO, set the scene with some water quality, look at LAWPRO's work, the Blue Dot Catchments Programme, and just different ways that communities and yourselves can get involved. So I think that we might all be able to agree with this statement here, that water is not a commercial product like any other, but rather a heritage which must be protected. And that's from the Water Framework Directive. You have the beautiful River Cary there in the background as well. So fresh water is one of our most important valuable resources. It's necessary for all life on Earth, and we don't have a lot of it. So approximately 0.1% of fresh water is available in our rivers, lakes, and wetlands. So this really does make fresh water a severely limited resource and well worth protecting. So what's driving LAWPRO and this programme? Our water quality and the need to improve it is rooted in the Water Framework Directive, which is a piece of legislation that was introduced in Europe in the year 2000. So what it does is the directive requires that all member states, so it's including ourselves, are to protect and improve water quality in all waters. So that includes our rivers, lakes, estuaries, coastal waters, and groundwater. And so the aim for that is that our waters must achieve at least a good, or in some cases, a high ecological status by 2027 at the latest. You can see there, second cycle, we're in the second cycle now, and we're coming up to the end of that. We're due to start the third cycle, which the Draft River Basin Management Plan will be coming out soon for that. So we're nearing completion of the second cycle and going into the third cycle. And that's what the framework is really concerned with. It's all about protecting, enhancing our waters, managing our water bodies in these units that we call catchments, and involving the public, which is extremely important as well. So in order to achieve this, what was set out with the Water Framework Directive, the Irish government established a national river basin management plan for Ireland, and it sets out steps to be taken to protect and improve our water quality. And these are just a few of the measures that are to be implemented over this period, essentially to help them to improve water quality. So you can see there's a focus on improving water quality in priority areas for action, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what those are. And we have two that are in the Kerry Biosphere. There was the establishment of the Blue Dot Catchments Programme, and that's to ensure that we protect our high status, so the top quality waters that we have as well. And this is actually particularly interest to Cary, as we have a lot of these high status objective water bodies in comparison to the rest of the country. So I'll be going through that with you as well. Then, so there was an extension of a local authority-led domestic wastewater treatment system. So there's a grants system, and this was extended. Grants available through a national inspection plan, and so they would be looking at areas to identify domestic wastewater treatment systems that mightn't be meeting the proper standards. So there's a grant available for that, but also grants available in priority areas for action if the system is determined to be affecting water quality negatively. And also, again, if you're in a high status objective catchment area, so these blue dot areas, then you could be eligible as well. And also another key measure was the Local Authority Waters Programme, so ourselves, LAWPRO, and our collaborative approach, the way we were approaching to the new way of thinking of improving water quality. So just a little bit about our water quality. Unfortunately, overall, our water quality in Ireland is under pressure from various impacts. So you can see there's 53% are in satisfactory status. High status has dropped by a third since 2009, and poor status has increased by a third since 2009. There have been some improvements in some water bodies as well. It's not to say that it's all been bad. However, the trends are definitely heading in the wrong way. And then just to look at the water quality in the Kerry Biosphere. So you can see the outline of the Kerry Biosphere there. And this is for the period of 2013 to 2018. And you'll see, so throughout the slides, you'll see that the colours will correspond to the status. So blue is high, green is good, yellow is moderate, and orange is poor, and then red is bad. And if it's unassigned, then it'll come in as grey. So you can see the current water status of some of the water bodies within the biosphere. You can see Loch Lean there, the large green water body at the centre, so that's at good status. And then the River Lown, which is exiting, is at good status as well. But the Low, which is just east of Loch Lean there, or sorry, west of Loch Lean there, that's yellow, so that's at moderate status, so it's not doing good. We can see Muckross Lake, which is just south of Loch Lean there, that's blue, so that's at high status, so that's doing good, but the upper lake is at moderate. And it actually looks like there's a lot of green on the map, which looks like, oh, great, that's good status. But that's if they're supposed to be achieving good status within the Water Framework Directive. So if they're actually in the blue dot, like that, those high status waters that I told you about, then they should be achieving the high. So for example, there we have the Flesk, which is east of Loch Lean, right over there. There's a long river there that's all green. So there's the Flesk and the Onikeeg River there. I think that's how you pronounce it. I am a Kerry woman, but some of the names, all right, do get the better of me. But I'll show you an example of that, of how you'll see which the high status and the current status compare in a little bit as well. So what is affecting the water quality? So for our catchments, we have a tendency to look at them really in a 2D manner, just to only really think about the surface waters and what we can see on top of the land. But we need to start thinking about them in a 3D way. So we need to think about water quality really in a holistic way. So what we do on the land can potentially get into the water table, into our rivers and lakes, and impact on water quality. Now you can see there can be lots of different pressures affecting water quality in a single catchment. There is wastewater pressures, urban pressures, so they could be through drainage or wastewater treatment. There could be pollution getting into storm drains, for example. You have agricultural pressures, so it could be fertilizer or excessive nutrients that are applied to the land, and they make their way into the system. It could be runoff from farm roads or farmyards, drainage, land reclamation. There's lots of different pressures. And then forestry, there can be planting and clear felling, which can lead to siltation as well. Water extraction pressures and septic tank pressures are just to name a few. So we have to think about all the different ways that the pollutants can really move and get into the system in order to be able to stop the negative impacts. And that's key to how we can improve water quality, really. So we all live in a catchment, and then you can see there can be many different pressures at play in our catchment. So as the water body moves from its source to its sea, a lot of different pressures can impact its water quality. And so this is the Blue Dot Catchments programme that I mentioned as part of the River Basin Management Plan, and when I'm referring to high status waters. So nationally, there are about 319 rivers, 37 lakes. There is transitional water bodies as well, and coastal water bodies, and they're all in the Blue Dot programme. So if you're looking at the maps there, you can see, like I said, in the southwest, we do have a high concentration of these Blue Dot areas. So they are important for us down in Cary here. But the high status sites are declining. So there has been a huge loss in the high status sites since the 1980s. So between the 1980s and like 2015, or some of the most recent data, it's been 50% loss. So our high quality pristine sites, they are nationally, they are on the down. So it's not a great story, but they are something to be celebrated as well, because they are the cleanest of our natural waters. As you can see there, they're quite rare. So like you can see, there's not a lot of them in Ireland. And this high status water, these high status waters are really essential for our salmon, our trout, You can see there freshwater pearl mussel as well, and a range of threatened insects and other invertebrates as well. So protecting high status waters, the program has a protect and a restore function. So that's what we're trying to do. So we're restoring those that are not achieving as they should be, and protecting the ones that are achieving their high status. And so just interestingly as well, the pressures that are on our high status waters are actually different than the pressures that are in the other water bodies that we have. So high status objective water bodies have a different set. So it's forestry, hydromorphology, and then agriculture. But the national picture actually, the most significant pressure on water quality is agricultural, then urban wastewater treatment, hydromorphology. So it's just a little bit different. They have a different set of pressures that we would be looking at under this program. And so in the Kerry Biosphere, you can see that you've got quite a few of our blue dots there. So the Flescan, the only Pygmy River, it's just east of Loch Catan there. Again, that big, large blue river, it's all connected. We have Muckers Lake, like I said, and that is a high status. There's part of the Finno near Loch Catan, the Girramaheen over in the west there, over in the very west, and the Onree, and then the Low, like I said, which is just to the left of Loughlin as well. So there's quite a few there, which is great, which is amazing as well for the Kerry Biosphere to have all of those high status objective sites within its boundary. But if we just look at the map, so this is just the water quality map that I showed earlier, and we can compare the water quality data with the blue dots, and we just get an idea of where we are with regard to the status. And we can kind of see that we do have a bit of work to do in the restore function, really. You can see there's quite a few of our blue dots that are good status, but they should be achieving high. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the Flescan, the only Pygmy River, just east of Loch Catan there, and the Low is at moderate. Both the Girramaheen and the Onra are at high status, which is great. They're over there in the west side of the catchment. So you can see there are ones that are holding their own and they're still achieving their high status. And work is being done in some of the areas within the Kerry Biosphere, and I'm going to talk to you about that next. And this is just a little bit about the structure of LawPro. So there's the communities team, of which I'm part of and I work, and our key role is community engagement. So we're all about encouraging communities to get out there and participate in any projects or actions that can help to protect and improve water quality. And then we have the Catchments team, and they are really concerned with the scientific assessments. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the Catchments team now. So the Catchments team work in priority areas for action. So I mentioned these were outlined in the River Basin Management Plan, and you can see there in the map on the left, there's quite a few across the country. There's actually 190 areas for action, and they're going to receive greater attention during our cycle, our second cycle. And the catchment scientists work in those areas, and they're really focused in on why is the water quality not achieving good status. You can see on the map on the right there, we have 12 priority areas for action. I mentioned that 2 were within the Kerry Biosphere, and that is the Deenach and the Finnow. So the Deenach priority area for action, the Deenach, you can see that's Loughlin there, it's feeding into, and it consists of 2 water bodies, and they're called Deenach 10 and Deenach 20. And the numbers are just EPA way of determining, like, you know, they can break them down, the water body, into kind of a numeric thing, and it helps to make a unit that they can kind of study a little bit easier. So the Deenach 10, which is the upper part there, the Deenach River, and its catchment area is the priority area for action. And unfortunately, it's currently at poor status. So this needs to be improved to good status. So that upper part there. And then you can see that the Deenach 20, which is just below it and flowing into into Loughlin there, that's actually a high status objective. So that's one of the blue dot rivers. And at the lower section, we have Loughlin as well, and that's very kind of a nutrient sensitive lake. So managing any of the nutrient inputs or anything to surrounding catchment area would be pretty good for that. So anything that we can help to do in the upper part, the DNUC 10 there, which is priority area for action, can only help to improve the water quality status further down. The DNUC is not achieving, DNUC 20, sorry, the high status objective one is not achieving its high status either. So really it's about helping the whole catchment system. You see the lines around the rivers there. So that is the catchment. So everything inside that line, all of the activities that are happening can influence the water quality of that water body. So that's the way the catchment is broken down as well. And then we have the Finnow over near Loch Gatan. There are two water bodies there. So we have the Finnow 10, which is shown in green there, which means it's a good status, but it's also a blue dot, so it should be achieving high status. And then the Finnow 20, shown in yellow, which is moderate status, and that's going around Loch Gatan as well. So there are two priority areas for action that are within the Kerry Biosphere. And just a little bit about some historical data that I thought was really interesting. And this is about the DNUC River, and it's a report of inspectors of Irish fisheries on the sea and inland fisheries of Ireland. That's a mouthful, and it was published. The publication was 1903. And basically they noted that there was a fish from a hatchery on the DNUC. It was caught, marked, and then recaptured over in the Lough. And it was weighing 2 pounds heavier at that time. So she had put on a bit of weight by the time she had gotten there. But that could be down to the amount of bugs and insects that were in the river, because we can see there that some of insects they had noted in 1837 in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. They said that there was 15 varieties of caddisfly recorded. So you can see there's been a huge interest in the biology of the river going back as well. They're just pictures of caddisflies there to give you an idea. It's just really interesting, the historical context for some of these water bodies as well. And of course, the Finnow, we have the importance of it for fishing. So we have accounts that were told anecdotally to the National Folklore Collection. So they made up part of the school's collection that were collected in the 1930s. If you haven't been in on ducas.ie, I would recommend it. It's just brilliant. Some of the stories are so lovely. And you have one here about salmon coming through the Clariny Lakes and up to the Flesk. And the larger ones do not leave the Flesk, but many smaller ones, they'll go to the tributaries of Flesk, like the Finnow as well. So just to highlight the importance for you. And just to mention as well about the DNUC and the Finnow, and along with much of the Kerry Biosphere is part of the Killarney National Park, McGillicuddy Reeks and Cary River Catchment Special Area of Conservation. And so some of the qualifying interests for that are brook lamprey, and we have some salmon there as well. So the DNUC and the Finnow, along with the other rivers in the system, are really important salmonid nurseries for the area. Like the fish will go high up into the system, up to the tops of our rivers to spawn. So all these rivers are really important for them. We have other species like eels in the Killarney system as well. So there's a strong possibility that they would be in the rivers as well. And you can just see a picture of the Clariny Lakes there. And it's just to kind of think about it, I suppose, that as a catchment and as a whole, and a system as a whole, that the Clariny Lakes and the rivers that feed into it are really operating as one system. And it's really important to kind of do what we can to protect the water quality and these species that live there and depend on it. So just a little bit about the monitoring that the scientists would do as well. So they do local catchment assessments, and there are several stages to this in the local catchment assessment. It starts off with a desktop study, and that's where they'll look at like all of the data that they can find. Any existing data on the PAA is gathered and assessed. And so they'll look at things like historical water quality data. They look at the potential sources of the pollution. They look at the different ways, like pathways that the pollution might get into the water body, and they'll have a look and see if they can identify any gaps, gaps in data or gaps in how the water flows, and that it might start or be impacting on the water quality. So they'll do that desktop study, and we do have a public meeting as well, so this is not totally exhaustive, but then they'll go out, they'll take field measurements, so they'll look at temperature and salt oxygen, and they'll do some chemistry sampling as well. And then the kind of, I suppose, nicer bit that I really love as well is they'll do some kick sampling. So what they do is they'll go out and they'll have a look to see what are the insects that are in the river. So the insects in the river are really important, these invertebrates, because they'll tell us what's been happening in that system in the river over a long period of time, whereas the chemistry will really just give us a moment in time, kind of snapshot. The insects really tell a good story of the water quality. So what they would do is they would look at the balance of the insect communities, so the different types that are there, how many of each type, and whether they're sensitive or tolerant. So we can see some of the sensitive ones there. There's mayflies, there's caddisflies, and stoneflies. So they're really sensitive to any pollution. So they like nice, good quality water. You see on the bottom there, there's some of the more tolerant ones like the flatworms and leeches. So they don't really mind. They'll hang out in poorer quality water. So it's looking at all of those different numbers of species that you would find there, and that gives us a really good indication of the water quality. And it's really lovely just to get down to the river if you can, if there's anyone who, like I'll talk to you about citizen science in a minute, just to get involved in it. It's really lovely because there's so many things in the water living there, and it's lovely once you start to get your eye into them. Then the catchment scientists, they will also do a stream walk. So they'll walk along or in the river or beside it, or the lakes as well. They're assessing, and they really take into account the full picture, if you like, of the water body. So they're kind of assessing and refining where the exact location or nature of the problems might be, and then that might help them to come up with the appropriate mitigation or areas that are things they can do to solve them. So once that assessment has been done, then hopefully it will indicate towards what could be causing impact on water quality. So LawPro works to identify the pressure along with the pressure owner. So for example, it could be agriculture, forestry, it could be wastewater, and then it will be referred. The issue will be referred on to the pressure owner, essentially. So let's say it was forestry that was one of the issues, then it might be referred on to Creelta, or if it was agriculture, then there's actually a private confidential service called the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advice Programme, ASAP. So if it was agriculture, it would be referred on to that, and the advisors would go out and they would work with the farmers within the PA. It's wastewater treatment, then referred on to Irish Water, and so on. So it acts as a referral system. So that's basically just kind of a snapshot about the way the PAAs are monitored and kind of what's done then as well with the pressures that are identified. And just a bit about the communities team that I work in. So I've explained to you about the catchment scientists, but they just specifically work in the priority areas for action, whereas the community water officers work across the whole country. So I work across the whole of County Cary. And basically what we do is we offer support to communities undertaking any water quality projects to help improve water quality. See there, we can help establish groups, or we work a lot with funding for communities as well to try and advise them. We do have a fund. It's called the Community Water Development Fund, and like it says there, it supports community initiatives. Now, it's been oversubscribed, and it was oversubscribed last year as well, which is actually great, because it does indicate that there is a huge interest from communities in really the management and improvement of their local water bodies. So it's really good, and you can see that these are some of the types of projects that could get funded. So there's awareness, habitat enhancement, we have ecological surveys, there's invasive species, feasibility studies, and so on. So lots of different types of projects. And this is a really good guidance booklet that was put together by Law Pro and Leisure, and it just shows you the opportunities that are out there that you can work on water-related projects. So there's a wide array. So this is just one snapshot out of it page, but it'll talk you through different projects and how to go about them that could be undertaken across the whole catchment to improve water quality. So you can see there's an example of silt trapping, rainwater harvesting, fish passage projects, citizen science, wetlands to promote wildlife and reduce pollutions and flooding, and so on. So it's just a really good book. Gives you a more in-depth look at potential projects. And I mentioned about citizen science and getting down to the river and having a look at the insects that you might find, and they might be able to help you indicate the water quality. And this is the Citizen Science Stream Index. So it's actually a national strategy that is being developed as a citizen science tool. And you can see there is the green and the red boxes. And so the green ones are our sensitive species. So we'd like to be seeing a lot of those. And then the red ones are our more tolerant species. If you just go out and do a quick sample, it's quite straightforward and easy. And so it's a good scheme, and it's being rolled out at the moment. So if anyone's interested as well, you can get in contact with me. And then I just wanted to highlight some of the projects. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the projects that are going on in Cary, but just to make you aware of some of them as well. You can see the blue dot logo next to them because they would be concerned, or they would have aspects to them as well about the blue dot program, or high status objective water bodies. Actually, a lot of them do have smaller parts as well to do with them, like the water quality and biodiversity training in IRD to Hallow. So that was rolled out just recently. It was a really successful training program, and some of the water bodies within that training area were high status objective water bodies as well. So it would have taken that into account, the blue dots. The Riverfield Integrated Catchment Management Plan. So that's a big plan that is just being launched. And we have there the New Zealand Pygmy weed removal project. So that was done last year, and it was another successful project with leader funding. So a good few of these are leader funding as well, so they deserve a mention, along with Law Pro funding. And then you see our Natterjack toad in the centre there. That was just an educational resource that was done with the Mallory's Conservation Association. We have down in the Evora, the Sustainable Development and Usage of the Waterville Catchments and Ballinskelligs Bay plan. So lots going on around Cary as well, just to give you a flavour. On the left there, I've said about the Local Authority Waters Programme. I actually did a digital journey through a selection of blue dot catchments as part of Heritage Week last year. And it's a story map, and it'll take you on a little journey of some of the blue dots that you would find within our PAs. And then I've highlighted cards from the water side, and I have a little bit more about that in the next slide, but you can see the PAs that are involved in that. So there's the Field, Falduff, Upper Main, Lee, Onmore, Innie, Locharan, and the Deanoch. So the Locharan is high status objective, so that's included in the project there as well. And just to give it a little bit of a plug, cheekily, but we're having a launch event on October the 24th for this project that Creative Ireland funded, and with support from the Cary County Council Arts Office. And it's all about bringing artists together with local communities and having a discussion about what the community values about their local water body. and basically why it's important to the locality. So at the end, there will be a greeting card that will be printed out for the communities, and they'll have that as a resource going forward. So just an example as well of how different strands of funding can complement more than one theme there as well. And we're nearly there. I just wanted to highlight this before I finish up. Just to say, I said we're nearing the end of the second second cycle of the River Basin Management Plan, and we'll be going into the third. And so there is a public consultation that will be taking place, and it's coming up very, very soon. The draft River Basin Management Plan is due out any day now. And so there'll be loads of details. Hopefully you'll see it all across Cary. I'll be running meetings and that to come along and get involved and have your say. And so, like I said, there'll be more information coming out about that very soon. And that's a big thank you from me. And I hope I wasn't too much overtime on there. But there's my contact details. And if you just drop me a line if there's anything water quality related you want to chat about.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Breda. I have to say, I love the maps. I love seeing the the maps and seeing it laid out like that. It makes it very clear, I think, for people. And it's really interesting as well, like you said, about the cards from the Waterside project, how pulling in sort of different strands are really complementing each other with your work there as well, coming from the more arts heritage perspective, but using that to strengthen people's connection to water heritage as well is fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely way to do it, and the project is running like we've got a few weeks left in it, but so far so good. Like, everyone's just been great. The artists have been amazing, communities have been amazing. So yeah, it's just been a lovely project to be involved in.
Great stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing it in Clariny House as well. You have an exhibition there too, don't you?
Yeah, so yeah, there'll be a launch event and an exhibition, and that'll run from the 24th. So yeah, we're excited about that as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. And for anyone really interested, if you get a chance to go and do the citizen science water quality training, definitely do it. I did it with my local community here in Caherdaniel, and it's super interesting, but also a huge amount of fun as well, in learning about them, getting in the river, finding the insects, learning how to spot them because they're so tiny. But yeah, definitely well worth getting involved with.
No, it's great. And like I was saying, once you start to get your eye into the insects and the different ones, it's really enjoyable, and you're creating data as well. You know, you can create data that feeds into kind of a bigger picture, a national, like I said, national strategy, national picture as well. So it's well worthwhile getting involved as well.
Great stuff. So thanks very much, Breda, for that. So we're going to pass on now to Fran, who is going to share some of his knowledge about Arctic char. We won't probably share all of his knowledge because I think we'd be here for much longer than the time we've scheduled. So thanks very much for joining us, Fran.
Oh, no problem, Eleanor, no problem. Is that sharing for you there?
Yeah, it's sharing, or we're just waiting for it to go to full screen.
And I'll flip this over now.
So yeah, that's you've got presenter view on there, if that's all right for you. Oh, yeah, now it's full screen. Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. How long do I have now? You can be ruthless. Just tell me 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
You have 20 minutes, Fran. You're good.
Yeah, I try and rock on. Yeah. Okay. So So first of all, thanks for the invitation. And I have to say, for me, this is a trip down memory lane. Really, what I'm going to present is actually work mostly done by volunteers and by partners involved in a group, and explain in a minute a voluntary group. So, but it ties very much into what Breda has just presented about, in that the species of fish, it's so unique. It's unique to Cary, the genetic, from a genetic point of view, and Norway. We'll talk about that later on, and I'll give some examples. So, from the point of view of the biosphere and County Kerry generally, it is a very special species. So, look, I'll just drive on and I'll give you a bit of a context. So the beginning of this story, the Arctic char story in Ireland, goes back to the last ice age, when the ice was receding back about 18,000 years ago or so. And the char would have come in then from either from the west or from the southwest and colonized our rivers, which at the time would have been virgin territory. And there was nothing else there. The ice would have wiped out pretty much everything. And the landscape would have looked pretty much like this in a lot of areas. Now, you would have had maybe tundra type landscape further south and southwest, you know. So of the endemics or the truly native species in Ireland, the Arctic char are definitely definitely there, and they would have been the first fish to colonize the country. And then following the char, then we would have had another series of, or suite of migrations of other fish species too. Not as widely distributed, but also important. So the Clariny shad is one, of course, which occurs in Lough Lane. Very unique. It's a landlocked version of the Twait shad, and very unusual. It doesn't occur anywhere else in Ireland or the UK. And there's a few landlocked versions over in Italy, but not that many. So it is special. And then you have the European smelts as in the Field estuary, again, not that well or widely distributed. So you have these unusual fishes down here which are worth cherishing. And Breda did mention the lampreys. There's 3 lamprey species, but I suppose the ones that would be most common down in Cary, I think, are the brook lamprey that I would have seen anyhow, and the sea lamprey as well. And sea lamprey again would go into the national park, into the lakes there as well. And then brown trout, which are fairly common, but brown trout actually break down into a whole myriad of categories or what they call conservation units. They're genetically unique and adapted because again they would have come through in the ice age. You would have had several waves coming in after the char, and then each wave would have colonized and competed. And that's so the trout, for example, down in Waterville, the sea trout would be quite unique compared to other trout populations. So there's a lot going on with trout, and nationally we have different anglers would have put names on these things back in the day. Different on kind of color and their shape and so on. So in Loch Melvin, they call it the Gilroon Sonahan. You also have the Furrox, the fish-eating trout. We definitely have Furrox trout in Lough Lane. We have them in Lough Cara. We came across them in our surveys. So, you have this, a variety of trout, and these are genetically will be very old. We'll go back to the Ice Age. Now, look, to bring it forward to the char. The char, very unusual species, very unique species, very special species. They're ecologically very sensitive, but they're very beautiful. And people who work with them or have come across them tend to kind of, I wouldn't say fall in love with them, but it's kind of like there is a butterfly effect. They're very pretty. The top fish there you can see is a male. They develop these lovely vibrant colors during spawning season, and then the females not so pretty. A bit of opposite to humans. So but they're pretty cool, and they come from this the Sabalinus genus. So you have lake trout, brook trout over in North America. We just have the char, but you have the Dolly Varden, another version of a char, basically. So, on this side of the Atlantic, it's just a char that we have here and in Ireland. But if you look at the distribution today, the ice has receded, and the populations have moved north. They would have been migratory. They would have run to sea like salmon, but as the seas warmed up, then that changed. So in Ireland, all our char populations are landlocked or stay in freshwater. Their lake residents don't go to sea, and that would include those in Clariny. Sorry, in Cary. So the story that I'm going to give is about the char in Cary. Is basically based on the work done by these guys here, the Irish Char Conservation Group, which are a ragtag bunch of volunteers, scientists, and people just adventurers who went into lakes, including lots in Cary, to see what's there and either find out where to chase up old records of char and then discover other records. And then we linked up with another group called the International Society of Arctic Char Fanatics. It turned out there's other people who are also into this kind of stuff across Europe, into Japan. There's about 16 different countries involved. And again, these scientists, they are doing really super duper stuff in genetics and stable isotopes and a whole range of different techniques. So they came over and they would have taught us a lot of stuff. So this is pre-water framework directive days. A lot of techniques, say for example those gill nets, they are now the standards that are used in the water framework directive. So it's interesting, we were kind of ahead of the curve. So this is the guys setting a net here. So all kinds of conditions. We went out and to try and find out what's going on. This is a professor from Canada setting gill nets there on Loch Acus. And then we would have also mapped the lakes, the bathymetry, to find out how deep these lakes are, because that is important to try and understand the fish populations. So if you have more than one basin, like for example here in Loch Cara, you're more likely to get different groups of fish, and that's exactly what we found with the trout in Loch Cara. And it wasn't always easy. We didn't always have the right gear. So this is us snorkeling in one of the lakes in the middle of the winter. It was pretty damn cold, I can tell you. But when you travel 5 hours to get to the lake, you're going to have to go in. So we'd warm up a few whiskies afterwards, and carry hospitality. But it's all worthwhile, So I'll show you some of the stuff we did. But basically, we were able to map the distribution of char, build on knowledge that was there, and you can see there the distribution of char that we mapped back in 2009. And you can see the Cary spots there where they're present, quite a lot down in Cary actually. And then we would have given this data to Cary County Council and to the various planning authorities and so on. So and also the landowners, and I have to say that really appreciate the encouragement and the interest of the landowners. And they were very interested in this because it's something unique to them. They would have brought their kids down to see the fish and all that. So really, really nice experience. Okay, so Char and Cary. So for us, it was great to go down and look at, check out these places because these are Arctic lakes, effectively left over from the Ice Age. Really beautiful. You notice the landscapes that you're dealing with. They are rugged. They're fantastic visually. So we were like tourists, just having great fun, and making these discoveries. So the Tecumseh Heron Lake down in Cary, for example, outside Glen Bay, very, very pretty lake. And then, of course, what came out of the lake, these are the fish from a photograph taken by a friend of ours on the survey, and you can see how pretty they are, the Tecumseh Heron char, which are a dwarf form of char. I'll come back to them at that point in a minute. Working in Cary, you have to acknowledge all these guys that were involved with loads of different university students got involved from Queen's University, and Noah will talk later, so that's a follow-on. It's about a third or fourth iteration at this stage now, Noah's work. University of Waterloo, Canada, Trinity, and you can see all the PhDs there. I won't read them all out. So, a lot going on, and this was all done purely voluntary by the volunteers, and then we fed into all these programs. Sorry. So what we found with regards to the data is that with regards to Cary, we found not only do we establish the presence of char in quite a number of lakes that had previous records by anglers, whatever, but we also established that there was quite a few lakes which had never been studied before, and we discovered that there was char in those lakes. If you look at the blue at the bottom, so you can see there's Cally, Gura, Cumloughlin, Dariana, Cara, Clune, and Cumnaglasha, and Namona as well. They're all Cary lakes. We one or two of them, like Namona, we had anecdotal information from anglers that there was char there, but I mean we were established scientifically, yes, there were there. So that's quite a significant finding in itself, to add those to the records. And then we were able to say, look at Cary and Inchiquin and Clooney, to say that look, these lakes still have char, so looking at some of the surveys we did, in Muckross Lake, we did a survey back with the Arctic char fanatics back in 2022. National Parks kindly allowed us to use their facilities, and they were great. We had a big conference there over a number of days, and that was an opportunity to bring the scientists out and actually study the lake. So we set a load of gill nets, and we did some hydroacoustic work as well. This is what we found in the upper lake to start with. That was a follow-on survey in 2003. Trout, perch, but no char. Anglers have said that they've seen char, but we never were able to confirm that. In Muckross Lakes, this is where it got interesting. We did find char, and we found lots of them. And the char traditionally known in Muckross Lake were known as the Savalinus obtusus, which is the blunt-snouted char. So the old taxonomy would have recognized them as being a separate species. And what we found was when we looked at the char, they all had these stubby noses. So yeah, I mean they're morphologically or from a shape point of view, they're different. This is Fred Curtis from the US Fish and Game. He was doing the hydroacoustic work with us. So that's an echo sounder there from the boat there going across Muckross Lake. And then we did these transects, and you can see there in the blue there, that's where we start picking up shoals of fish, which were obviously char. When we looked at the fish themselves, we didn't know how old these fish were, how long they lived. So we analyzed, looked at there's a little bone in the head of the fish, and we were able to age the fish from that, looking at rings, a bit like tree rings. And we were able to find out that, based the population in that lake, they were living up to 7 or 8 years old, females living longer than males, you can see there. And so that's quite typical of char in Western Europe, where you're in a warmer environment. If you're further up in Greenland in the north, they tend to live a lot longer and older, but they will grow much, much slower. So in Ireland, what's happening here, for example, in Muckross Lake, you can see year 1, year 2, year 3, that slope is quite steep, and then it levels off. So they mature, and then it levels off, and then they don't live that particularly long. Not bad, I mean, the same length as a trout, actually longer than trout would live. So that was an interesting finding itself. Then we looked at their diet, and this is where it gets really interesting in terms of the ecology. We found that the fish in September were feeding on basically plankton. So they're all plankton species that we're feeding on, right? So, and that was the traditional view, char feed on plankton. Anytime we look at their stomachs of the char, they're feeding on plankton. But of course, the surveys are always done in the summertime, generally speaking, in fisheries. But when we looked at the stable isotopes, So the isotopes are basically our signature, which the food will leave longer because it transmits into the mussels. And I can't explain the science of this in one time, but basically what we found was that the isotope signatures in the char flesh was different to the isotope signatures in the stomachs of the char, right? So what basically most of the mussel mass, most of the fish was being put on at a different time of the year, i.e. in the winter time. And those signatures came from invertebrates that were living in the bottom of the lake, right? In the littoral. So like shrimps and acellas and waterlouse, that type of stuff, or snails. Normally it's the trout that feed there and the char feed in the deeper water out in the open water. So what's basically happening here is that in the wintertime, the trout slow down, gets colder, they stop feeding, and then the char move in. Trout are dominant, the char move in and start feeding. So this was a new discovery. And that was all done in Muckus Lake, and that all became published. So that was really cool work that came out of that. So basically, the trout and the char switch over. So with climate change, that could be disrupted, and we could find that the trout will keep feeding over the winter, and that would be a problem for the char. In terms of life history, then we looked at, where did they spawn? Where did they lay their eggs? They lay their eggs in lakes, generally, occasionally in rivers, in lakes. So we were the first group basically to identify where do char spawn in Irish lakes, and then document it. That guy there's Neil Irwan. He did some of the early studies with us as well. He's now working with the Institute. So we would have then worked out where to spawn and then the depths of the spawning beds, and we measured the locations. This is a little egg here smiling back at us here from one of the spawning beds there, you can see. And then we would have measured, and then we would have looked at the substrate to see what's going on, So they tend to spawn in gravel that's kind of from a fist size down to maybe, that size, small gravel. And that's me standing in Coomsaharn Lake, I think. And you can see then the graph there showing where the spawning bed is in terms of its distance from the shore and its depth. Okay, and that's important because if you look at what's happening in lakes, we abstract water from lakes. Littoral areas, these shallow areas can be vulnerable to algal blooms and that. So if those char, and as happened in Lough Fad in Donegal, if there's a drawdown when the char lay their eggs in the shallow area, well then the eggs are going to die, and then you're going to get an impact and you lose a year class, which exactly happened to us in Donegal. Back to Cary, what was interesting was that we found that the fish were spawning that bit later. Normally it's spawned in November. They were spawning in December into January. And when we looked at Loch Cally and Gura, we discovered there was char in those lakes. Nobody knew this before in the Hags Glen that we were aware of. Maybe local people knew it, but it certainly wasn't scientifically shown. And we snorkeled the lakes and we found that the char were only spawning in Cally over in that spot there on the right-hand corner, right? And this is actually one of the char eggs. So this is actually a Kerry char, a Kerry char egg in the making. So this char egg is literally less than 10 centimeters below the surface. So that's how shallow the water is. So that's only that, yeah. So if you draw the water down, obviously they're very vulnerable to desiccation and to loss. So that was an interesting discovery for us. Then with the spawning beds, Jonathan Lowe, working with UCC and ourselves, he came in and looked at this in more detail. We got a PhD going basically, and Jonathan then did the work. So you can see there are Coomsaharn and the Coos, the two catchment areas there, and Clune Lake and Cara. We're near in the Glen Bay area there. He looked at Clune Lake, a number of lakes, but I'm only showing you Clune Lake. You can see the bathymetry map there, and he then mapped out the spawning sites in the lake. You can see where they're spawning, and he was able to work out from that then that there was different spawning groups of char coming into different areas, and we know from the genetic works that there's a number of different populations of char in that lake. Okay, so again, really good research that was coming out of this. This is the chart he produced for the spawning period. So you can see the spawning period for that particular lake into December. As I said, in Donegal, it's normally November, early November, into mid-November. Well, here you have it, it's into December. In Loch Cally, it was actually into January. The 10th of January is when it spawned. So you can see the hatching period then, and then the swim up. And this follow. You can look at the temperatures. If you follow the temperature profile, around 9 degrees is where they start spawning. Okay, so this is important again in terms of climate change and that type of stuff. When John looked at the other fish species in the lakes, he looked at the ecology in terms of the interaction between the char and the trout. And what he found was that the trout were coming in Loch Cara to feed on the char eggs. So the char would lay their eggs to kind of just lay eggs, just kind of splatter the eggs all over the rocks. But in Cara, the trout were coming in and gorging themselves in the eggs. in Saharan, they weren't doing that. And we reckon what's going on there potentially is that Lough Cara is a richer lake, and that the trout are probably bigger. In Saharan Lake, the trout and char are more or less the same size, so that as the trout get bigger, they're more likely to go in and start predating on the eggs. That's what we're finding there, right? Now, in terms of the shape of the fish, the color of the fish, this is something which people have remarked on over the last number of years, since people have been writing records in char, that you have each char looks different in each lake. And what does that really mean? And now with modern science, we can look at this in terms of, is it nature, is it nurture, is it just the environment, or is there nature, or sorry, is there a genetics underpinning this? And if so, that's important in terms of conservation, because if that is the case, then these populations really are unique, and therefore, the char in one lake is not the same as another lake, so we should be trying to protect them all. So this is just a slide to show you the differences in length of char in Ireland, in terms of the range. So you have the two big char there from Loch Mask over in Mayo, and then you have our little dwarf char in Saharan Lake there in Cary. And you can see that the size difference. So the question there would be, are these differences real, or is that just to do with feeding, or is it actually to do with genetics? So we looked at that, and then look at the color. So look at the color of this char from Lough Cara. I mean, absolutely fantastic colors, really bright, vibrant colors, absolutely gorgeous. And then look at Muckross Lake. So these photographs are not, time-wise, not taken that far apart. In Muckross Lake, they're silver. So now they will kind of red up a bit in December, but you can see, and then if you look at the shape of the nose, look at the nose there, quite pointed, right? Look at the nose of these guys, quite blunt, okay? So again, is that real? Is that nature? Is that nurture, right? So we had the opportunity to look at this because we were doing all the surveys. With Saharan Lake, traditionally, we've known that the fish, their shape is different than other char. And one of the things that scientists look at are what's called the gill rakers. So underneath the gills, you have these little bony filaments, and that's used to sieve out plankton and stuff. It's what the fish use to feed on the plankton. The gill rakers, you have more gill rakers in the char in Saharan Lake than you have in any other population. This is established right back to when Tate Regan wrote the book on Irish fishes back in 1911, okay? These guys went in and did a study, a much more deeper study back and published a paper back in 2006, and they found that this was still the case. Now we went in and we looked at Saharan Lake, and we found that was the case. We looked at the gill rakers, but we also looked at another lake, Clúmna, which is right beside it. And Clúmna is in the same catchment, but it had never been surveyed before. Nobody knew what was in there. So this is what it was like on our day of survey. Absolutely shocking. It was like what's it called? What's that famous fish thing? Fish Wars, Salmon Wars, whatever. One of those kind of Netflix series. It was absolutely mad. It was unreal. There was white water everywhere. It was actually dangerous. That boat ended up getting blown across the lake and everything. And health and safety, how are you? It was absolutely, it was shocking. But we got it was really Arctic conditions, and we got some really good results. And these are the fish that we pulled out. Absolutely gorgeous. You can see the colors there. I mean, fantastic, so vibrant. Now, when we look at them up closer, you can see again, these are all males, these fish, amazing, the colors. When we looked at the gill rakers that I mentioned, you can see there for Saharan, this is from the paper that I mentioned. You can see the numbers. So if you look at the red box there in that paper there, you can see gill raker numbers 17 to 20, 18, 21. Look at that compared to the other lakes up and down the country. Okay, you have 13, 10, 13, 10, nowhere near as much. And the reason for that is because we think that the Saharan char adapted to be able to feed on more fine plankton. So they had evolved to feed on plankton, therefore they needed to have more gill rakers that were close together compared to other char that were probably feeding on benthic or feeding the bottom as well. Okay, this is what they found internationally. So when we looked at the gill rakers from the char in Clúmna Lake, this is a photograph from my microscope. You can see the gill rakers there, just to show you what they look like. We found that the range average was 17, thereabouts 18, the range of 17 to 20. So that's well within the range of the Saharan ones. So if you look at the Saharan ones there at the bottom, so 17, 20, 17, 20 for Clúmna, and then you look at some of the other Irish lakes, just on average, much lower. So what that is telling us is that those two populations are different. There's something going on. It's hardly a fluke of nature that they're genetically, doing something that's different. So whether they came from an original stock that was different that came in during the Ice Age, or whether they've come from the same population that over time evolved this unique condition, as maybe what's called a periglacial lake. So when the Ice Age receded, you would have these big lakes that would have expanded and contracted. Maybe that's what happened. But either way, it's something that's pointing very strongly towards that it's genetics that's underpinning this, and that's quite unique. Further, to underpin that whole discovery, let's say, or to prove that we know that there is differences, we also did a study with UCC. So UCC were interested in looking at the genetics of the char to look at aquaculture. So we teamed up with them. We had no interest in aquaculture, but we were interested in looking at this particular question. If you raise char that were, came from eggs, for example, in Loch Cara, or eggs from Saharan Lake or whatever, and raise them under standard conditions, would they all be the same? Or would they all grow the same, feed them the same, give the same temperature, standard conditions? Or if they're different, well, then clearly it's down to genetics. And this was the opportunity. So we took the opportunity and we looked at Saharan Lake, the dwarf form, and Cara, which were the bigger char. And we also looked at Loch Esk, but those ones died in the experiments, so that didn't work out. So I don't tell anybody, it had nothing to do with us. But anyhow, the results were as follows. What we found, or what they found, the researchers found, is you can see the lines there. So they had a control, which is a commercial stock, which were based up in Galway, which are from Canada, Yukon Gold. So you can see that the growth curves of the fish. This is all year one, so they would have hatched out in May and then June and so on for the first year. Now, if you look, you can see Loch Saharan there. Loch Cara is a pink line, quite close to the commercial stock. But then if you look at Saharan, you can see it's quite different, right? So that's pretty cool. That kind of proves the point for us. And then there's a whole lot of genetics that's come through from the samples that we've been working on. Inland fisheries have been working on samples. And Noah can talk about that later on, so I won't go into it. But basically, all those colours represent different genetics. And you can see down in Cary, what's going on there. There's a lot of genetic diversity there. So really exciting, really special, these char. Now, I'm going to finish up now because I'm just conscious of time for you. Having said all of that, that's really nice. That's really interesting, and it's important. They're important findings. And I'm delighted to be able to put it all together for this event, which is cool. But, the story, we have to go back to water quality and what Breda was showing there. If you look at this map here, these arrows all are pointing to char lakes in County Kerry. Not them all, but just examples of some of the lakes I've just talked about there. And if you look at the different colours, they represent the current water quality for those lakes. Now, think about it. Char need really clean water. They need to have high status. So what Breda mentioned, high status, they need that high status. So all these arrows should be blue. So we have 1, 2, 3 blue, mostly green. That's not good enough. Orange, so you're into poor or moderate, not good enough. Definitely not good enough. And then yellow and bad. So there's a problem here in terms of Arctic char, in terms of water conservation. We should be trying to get the water quality in all these areas up to blue, up to high status, up to blue dot level. So look, and if we do that, that'll also benefit the pearl mussels and it'll benefit the salmon in the systems that have them as well. So look, in conclusion, Eleanor, as I would say, the char in Cary, pretty cool, quite unique. And hopefully I've convinced you of that. There's been quite a few undiscovered populations since 2000, which we discovered, which is nice. Interesting from a scientific, heritage, natural perspective. I think they should be celebrated. And we know that there's different functional differences, which means that each of those populations I've just talked about are unique in their own right, and each one of those should be protected for their own right and celebrated, not just put in a museum mantelpiece, but celebrated because it's something cool that the kids in Cary can say, we have this stuff here that nobody else has in Ireland or in the world. So look, on that note, I'm just going to finish and just dedicate my presentation to the volunteers who worked so hard dragging boats and lugging stuff up and down the mountains. So it wasn't just in Cary, we're all over the country, so it was good fun. So look, and that's it. So I just want to say thanks, Eleanor, and hopefully cheers.
Thanks, Fran. You absolutely have me convinced, and I'm sure everyone else as well, about how cool Arctic char is. And one thing that really struck me is how significant a contribution the volunteers made to getting that research going, which is a really interesting point as well. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. Fantastic. I think we'll probably have you back again to talk more about this, because I think everyone will have questions. It's really a really interesting topic. And the genetic diversity as well, I think, is something that's so fascinating that I suppose years ago we wouldn't have had the capacity to begin understanding that, whereas now with the advances in technology you're able to do that, which is another really cool part of your presentation. So thanks for sharing all that. So we'll move on now and we'll introduce Stephen O'Shea, who works with the Pearl Mussel project. And as Fran was talking about working to get the status of the water qualities, and Breda was talking about to help improve the status of the water qualities, Stephen is working on a project that is attempting to start to do this in parts of Cary. So thanks very much for joining us, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. It's some very interesting information there from Fran and Breda. Right in my backyard there. I'm from Glenby, so very familiar with Cary Lake, right beside Cary Lake. I live right beside Cary Lake. I was brought up there, and Coomasahern Lake is a fantastic spot as well. Sure, it's a fantastic part of the world. So I am going to present. You can see my screen there, yeah.
Yeah, if you just go to slideshow, we're still in the.
Okay,
that's perfect. Yeah, thanks.
That looks good.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to present to give a bit of an overview on the Pearl Mussel project, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of slides on the Pearl Mussel itself, and the results-based approach we take, I suppose, and who we're working with, and the farmers, and what actions they take on the ground, and I suppose the design of the results-based approach, which is relatively new, I suppose. It's been happening in the Burn project for quite some time, but the whole idea is, I suppose, that the farmers on the ground that are farming environmentally are protecting habitats, that they're the ones that get rewarded for that their payments reflect that protection, that those ecosystem services that are provided by those habitats, that the farmers that are going above and beyond the usual, that they're the ones that are rewarded. So it's a results-based payment scheme targeting an endangered species while delivering wider environmental benefits. So we work within the top 8 catchments in Ireland. I'll mention those a bit more in a minute. And those top 8 catchments contain 35% of the freshwater pearl mussel population in Europe. We're funded by the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development Programme 2014 to 2020. We're one of many EIPs around the country, European Innovation Partnership, with a total budget of 10 million. So the project is a 5-year project. We're about halfway through at the moment. It will run on until December 2020. It has a locally led element to it. So we have a small enough team, but there's the main office in Kenmare. Patrick Crutchfield is project manager, and I'm working on the ground here down in the southwest. We have Mary Catchment Gallagher also an ecologist on the project, and there's another catchment officer up in the northwest, Mary McAndrew, and Michael Chapman is working with us for the last 5 or 6 months as well on the ground down here and all over the country. He's up and down the country quite a bit. So the key stakeholders are obviously the farmers. We have ecologists on the team, and there's a steering group with ecologists, and farm advisors play a very integral role. And of course, we are working closely enough at times with NPWS and the EPA and Law Pro and all those department itself, of course. So that particular photo there is from the catchment in Glencar. Actually, Fran mentioned the Clune Lake, so that's Clune Lake. That's Owen Ray that flows out from Clune Lake there in the background. So the advisors, I suppose, are playing an integral role in the whole setup of the program. So there's about 61 advisors trained. They're not all active advisors, but maybe 35 or 40 active advisors. And there's a training program every year for them to upskill. And there might be some modifications or changes recommended by them or by us. So we support them, and there's the link to the farmers. The farmers can contact us directly, of course, as well. But I suppose a lot of the advisors do have that relationship with the farmer for, in some cases, 15 and 20 years. So if we want to make changes on the ground, they're very important. They're the people that can deliver the message. So we're fairly reliant on them. So the top 8 catchments we are working in. There's one up in Donegal, Glashkeelan, a small catchment, and 2 in Galway there, the Devereux and the Onriff and the Bundarha and Mayo. And then down in the southwest, we have one small little catchment in Onagapple called the Onagapple there near Argroom, West Cork. And the 3 Kerry catchments there are all together down here in the southwest. So this is the Cary catchment here, Clariny Lake up this on the southwestern side of it, and look at Coos up here in the northwestern side of the northeastern side of the catchment. And we have the Blackwater down to the south here. So it's Loch Bren there. The Kildove comes out of that river, an important Pearl Mussel river. And the Blackwater, the main river down in that catchment, is the Blackwater itself. The headwaters are up around here, and in the pocket up there, and so they meet halfway down, and then you have another little subcatchment there, the Arc, and that water drains south down into Kinmare Bay. And back here in the Corran catchment, we call this the Corran catchment, but the main river there is flowing out of Derryana Loch, called the Cumara. And there's another quite a few lakes. I see a lot of them are listed in the last presentation there. Loch Namona and Clune Loughlin. And down here in the south of this catchment is another little sub-catchment in Glenmore. The Coppell River flows into Loch Corran there. Both the Cumara and the Coppell flow into Loch Corran. And then back in here into the Cara catchment, there's the main one there, of course, is the Upper Cara. And we have a couple of tributaries there as well, the Cara Beg that flows out to Loch Coos, the Onray, the Muillock River. So I suppose in terms of pearl mussels, I think there's an estimated pearl mussel count in the whole of the country across, I think, 19 catchments of about 11 million, and that makes up 46% of the European population. And in these 3 catchments alone here in Cary, we have 5.8 million in those 3 catchments, which we have a healthy quarter. There's about a quarter of the European population in Cary alone. So even outside of the areas that we work in, the Garamian in the Black Valley is another one. There's a Sneem River down in the close by to our catchments, and over in West Kerry, then you have there's another pearl mussel river there near Clahan. So, and even in the Behy River, there's a couple of pearl mussels found, but the stronger ones are here in these catchments. So, in terms of hectarage, I suppose we're working across there's about 40,000 eligible hectares across the 8 catchments, and again, these are the Cars by far the biggest one, and between the 3 of them there, they make up about just over 27,000 hectares. So. Well over nearly 65 or 70% of the area that we work in. So these catchments, I suppose they're all similar historical managements. I mean, if you look at the map there alone, you can see they're brown in nature. So an awful lot of blanket bog, wet heath, dry heaths, wet grassland, little bit of dry grassland. Bedrock is dominated by old red sandstone. The soils are predominantly peaty in nature. Few exceptions, I suppose, close to the river where you'd have alluvial soil, and historically managed very, very similar, the same, those 3 catchments. But I suppose we should be very proud that we have such a strong population of pearl mussels in these catchments, and I suppose that happened because that change didn't come into these catchments the same as quick as it came into other areas in Ireland and across Europe. I think in the 20th century, nearly 90% of pearl mussels was lost across. 90% of the pearl mussel population was lost across Europe. So I suppose that change didn't come. That intensification didn't arrive in these catchments. But unfortunately, I suppose in the last couple of decades, I suppose there is change there. There is land use change. And in the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of forestry put into these places, which had an impact. I think in the Cary catchment there, we're up around 8% forestry, and the Blackwater catchment is about 15% forestry, and the Crown catchment is about 5% forestry. But so we were lucky enough that the change came kind of late, but we have to keep our eye on the ball, you know, and I suppose we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here tonight. So we have to ensure that we protect what we have, and in terms of the fresh pearl mussel, we kind of have to do more than protect, because while we have an awful lot of pearl mussels in those rivers, the unfortunate thing is that we don't have that recruitment to sustain them. So we kind of have to, the habitats that they're dependent on need to improve. You know, it's not a matter of maintaining those habitats, we have to improve them. So that's the main area where I work down in the southwest. We'd be up the country a little bit, but this is the main area. It's a fantastic place to be working in. Very, very beautiful scenic areas, you know, all glaciated lakes. So for the next couple of slides, I'm just going to run through the pearl mussel itself, what it is. It is a unique enough species, not too charismatic and flamboyant, but very interesting nonetheless. You can see a photo of them there on that photo there. They're a mollusk. They're an invertebrate. They don't have backbone. They're soft tissue, and they have 2 shells of a hinge. They live predominantly they live only in freshwater habitats. They like very, very clean, pristine conditions, fast flowing, well oxygenated water is what they rely on. I suppose one of the things about the pearl mussel, I suppose, when people that don't know too much about them, one of the striking things is how long they live. So here in Ireland, those pearl mussels can live up to 130, 140 years of age. Up in the north and Scandinavia and stuff, they live even a bit longer. So they're extremely sensitive to changes in water quality, and they spend most of their lives buried or partially buried in the sediment. They're filter feeders, so an adult mussel has the potential to filter 50 litres of water per day. That's how they get the oxygen into their lungs, into their gills, and that's how they feed as well. They take small particles of water, particles out of the water. And they have the ability to clean water as well. They can take pathogens out of the water, you know. One other thing about them, they are quite interesting life cycle. There's numerous stages, and they're dependent on a salmonid host for a certain amount of time. It takes them about 12 years to reach maturity. So this particular slide illustrates that cycle, and there's various different stages, as I mentioned. So if you have basically they're male and female, and they live in the bottom of the river, and the first stage is fertilization and grooving. So because they're living in a river, usually it's unidirectional flow, so they have to come up with a mechanism to keep their larvae in the river. If they use the same mechanism that a marine mussel uses, then they would be washed out to sea. So what happens is the male releases the sperm into the water column, and the female takes it in through the inhale and siphon, and the eggs get fertilized inside there in a brood chamber near the gills. They stay there for a while, and then she releases. She releases the larvae. They're called Glaucidia at that stage, and she could release anything up between 1 and 4 million Glaucidia. And these are the small little Glaucidia here up on the left-hand side, and they are very similar in shape to adult mussels, but they do keep their shells open, and they're in the water column for a short period of time. And that has to coincide with salmonids swimming in the water column. And the Glaucidia then, when they get close to the salmon, they start snapping their shells, and a very, very small percentage of them will be lucky enough to latch onto a gill of a salmon, and they'll stay there for the next 9 months or so. So that's what they look like there. If you go in there to a salmon, you'll see that on the gills, the Glaucidia attached. So at that stage, roughly about 5 or 7% survive that parasitic stage. So the next stage then is settlement. So when they eventually fall off the salmon, at that point they're about 0.4 millimeters in length, and they drop off, and they have to, if they're lucky enough to find a suitable habitat, you know, they potentially could live then for the next 120 years. So I suppose if there was no human impact at all in any of these places, they still may not find a suitable habitat. So that habitat has to have a stable substrate and you know, kind of a cobbly riverbed where the Glaucidia or the larvae can make their way down in there, and the water needs to be able to trickle through the rocks there, bring oxygen and food down to the juveniles. And I suppose that's where the main problems are, which we'll talk about in a while. So that's just the cycle, and as I mentioned there, they need to be lucky enough to drop off into a suitable location. The juveniles then they can remain in the substrate for 5 years before they are big enough to go on top of the substrate, where they'll be able to withstand the flow. And I suppose that at that stage, that's where the problems are in terms of siltation and sedimentation and flow and all those things. So what's very, very important in these catchments are seepage zones and wet areas, wet grasslands and flushes, and especially those areas that are close to the river. And they provide that slow flow of water, and they provide food to the juvenile mussels. And they're the kind of habitats that we're trying to protect and put value on and reward farmers for protecting. So, and of course, as I mentioned early on, you need, we are lucky enough to have an awful lot of pearl mussels, but in order to have a sustainable population, you need a proper, even demographic population. So what we tend to have at the moment is a lot of larger, older mussels in the middle of their lives, and if the trend continues, you know, I suppose they won't look good. So we need change on the ground. And the threats and pressures are flow, especially in the 8 catchments. The 8 catchments were chosen because they're the 8 best catchments, and it's been, I suppose, it's been acknowledged at this stage that flow is probably one of the biggest threats, you know, especially in these 8 catchments. And when I talk about flow, I suppose 2 of the threats are too strong a flow and too low a flow. And I suppose that's coming from, you know, historical drainage in the last number of decades, water coming off the land too quick, and then you know, during, I suppose, what we've been experienced recently is you know, longer periods of drought, and getting lower flows in the summertime is another critical stage for survival of the mussel. Water quality itself, of course, is an obvious one. Siltation, sedimentation, making its way into the river, down into the riverbed, degrading the habitat. And then the nutrients are nutrient enrichment. That's more of a silent one, I suppose. You know, you could have a farm that's actually scoring quite high in our system, but a farm may be scoring very high from a habitats perspective, but the greener fields might be receiving a lot of nutrients, and they mightn't be scoring very high. But what happens in these catchments, I suppose, is that the farms are quite big. They might, I don't know what the average size farm is, but it could be, there'd be no problem having 100 acres or 200 acres, even more. And a lot of the time it's a whole host of habitats, but there might only be 10 or 12 acres of good green land. And I suppose with changes in recent decades, with more sausage units on the ground and stuff, that 10 acres may get an awful lot of slurry, and that's where that slurry only goes in one place then if it's not managed properly. And that's so they're the main threats to the pearl mussel. So our approach, I suppose, is a results-based approach. The higher the quality of the habitat, the higher the payment. And I suppose that we kind of, there's a couple of byproducts to that, in the sense that it so happens like that if you have a good quality bog in these places, you will score high, and as well as protecting water quality and regulating flow, a blanket bog also traps carbon, and I suppose also a lot of biodiversity. So what happens is essentially we're creating a market and for biodiversity and carbon trapping, and trying to reward farmers for the ecosystem service they provide. There's also a floodplain payment for farmers as well. So I suppose just there's a whole farm assessment also. So I suppose just to kind of give you an outline of what happens when a farmer joins the scheme. We get their maps and we break up their farm into the various different habitats: grassland, peatland, or woodland. So there's 3 separate scorecards for each of those, and the advisors go out each year and they score those farms. And those farms then, those scores are converted over into economic value. So, for example, a farm might get 5,000 euros, but because this project is very much weighted towards water quality, we have to bring in a whole farm score system as well. So that would mean that we have to assess the farmyard and also the nutrients, what slurry is being produced. And so if a farmer, for example, gets 5,000 from his habitats payment, the whole farm score will also be conducted on that farm, and there's 4 possible outcomes to that: excellent, good, inadequate, or poor. So if it's excellent, it's a 20% bonus. And if it's just good, he'll get his 5,000 euros or whatever the habitats results has returned. And if it's inadequate, then it gets 0.6. And that's where we have to, I suppose, the 0.6 identifies problems on the ground. And I suppose in the first year of the program, there was quite a number of 0.6s out there. And in 2020, we addressed those. And I suppose most farmers that engaged with agricultural advisors and ourselves came out of that 0.6 territory and up to the 1, and there was some improvement. So that's a summary of the way it works. You get a habitat quality payment, a floodplain payment, and that's multiplied by the whole farm score. As well as that, then there is a supporting actions payment. So it's one thing having a results-based payment, but like you could have a farm that's managing land very well from an environmental perspective, and they could get a very high habitat payment, and they could qualify for a floodplain payment. The floodplain payment is there for farmers that are in close proximity to the Pearl Mussel habitats, and he could also get a very good whole farm score. But that mightn't be so. That particular farmer could do quite well out of this project, and may not have to do any supporting actions. But you could have other farmers that might not have very high scores, and that's where the supporting actions come into play. So again, this slide is just talking about what we're trying to reward farmers for: all the various different ecosystem services: biodiversity, stable climate, carbon sequestration, protection of soil, clean water, flood management, aesthetic value, food and recreation, and well-being. So the supporting actions element to the program, again, I suppose one of the ones that some farmers have implemented is peat plugging, and that's it covers a lot of stuff. It slows the flow, which helps the Pearl Mussel habitat, and it also it's a re-wetting action and allows for carbon sequestration. So that's one example of one of the supporting actions that was put in one of the catchments by one of the farmers. Another popular one down here, which may not have a huge amount to do with water quality, but it is improves habitat, is rhododendron removal. So there's a lot of in the long term, it would dry out habitats and encroach on bogs and wetlands and dry them out if left unattended. So in the Cary catchment and the Blackwater catchment in particular, there is an awful lot of farmers have availed of that action. And we've training programs in place then to try and just to make sure that it's done properly. So when I started back in February 2020, this is one of the first outings we had in Clariny National Park. And unfortunately, we were hoping to do a lot more on the ground training, but COVID kicked off then, and we've been for the last year and a half. We're back out again now this year, this summer. We were out last summer as well for a few days up in Mayo, but we had to revert back to Zoom. But this summer we got out and we were out in the catchments training with the farmers. They have mandatory annual training, and that was very good in terms of exchanging ideas with the farmers on the ground, and some great discussions around the supporting actions. Really, we have some good farms out there with a lot of actions on them, and it's great to get farmers. I suppose we were limited to a smaller group as well, which worked very, very well. We were limited to 15, and sometimes there might only be 10 or 12 there. So it's great to bring a group of farmers onto a farm and show them in action and discuss it. And that was we had about, I think in each catchment we had about 3 days, 2 days in July and 1 in September. So we down in Cary we 12 about 12 training days, half days, with 24 half day sessions. So they worked very, very well this year after being cooped up for about a year and a bit. So most of the actions are very, very simple. Creating buffers, that's just a buffer zone that was put in back in the Cumara River. This is on the same farm. That's just a drain. When I seen that drain first day, it's a deep enough drain, but there was a couple of pinch points where cattle were coming in and out of it. But you can see that he didn't get paid to do that. We would have paid him, but he did it off his own bat. And you can see it's well vegetated there now, and trapping nutrients and sediment, and and that's in that buffer is down there at the bottom. So it's he's got buffers in his drains and buffers along the main river, so those things work quite well. This is one that this is another action, just to call it an Induced Wetland, but it's it doesn't look the best there now because it was just dug out a couple of hours previous, but it's basically essentially a couple of ponds which trap silt and sediment from getting into the river down there at that wire. That's the main Blackwater River is down there. So over time, we'd be hoping what we have there is a couple of different levels. So over time, we'd be hoping that that'll get colonized by aquatic species, and different types of species will colonize the different depths of water. And when you get a lot of vegetation in there, it'll act as both a nutrient trap and a sediment trap. This field is not used that intensely, but it does get a small amount of fertilizer. So there's a land drain going along there. So it's breaking the pathway, I suppose, to the main Blackwater River. So that's a quick synopsis on the projects there as a whole. There's could go into a lot more detail, but I kept it fairly short. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Stephen. It's fantastic to hear the work happening on the ground and to really see examples of it. And great to see the collaboration there between the farmers, the farm advisors, and the project. I think that's a really interesting model where the sort of the education is being spread throughout all of the stakeholders involved in managing the land, which I suppose really embeds it within that structure, which is great. So thanks so much for sharing that. I see Noé Bartholomew has just joined us as well, and he'll be speaking in a little bit about his PhD research, so welcome. So now we're going to go to John Quinlan, and we're going to have a little chat. So John, if you want to unmute yourself there, and Stephen, if you'll stop screen share, that's okay. Yeah. Before we start chatting to John as well, I meant to say to everyone, if you have any questions, we'll try and keep a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. So do use the Q&A box to drop any questions that you have in there. So John, thanks so much for agreeing to chat to us this evening. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself and the kind of work that you do?
Hi, Eleanor. I'm John Quinlan. I've been a fishing guide, a full-time fishing guide for 21 years now. I've been a fisherman all my life, really. I only moved to Cary about 25 years ago. I'm not a Cary man originally. I was born in Tipperary, went to England for a lot of years, and came back here, and just by accident ended up doing this job. Really, it wasn't intentional, but there seemed to be a gap in the market for what I was doing, and it's worked very well. We've got a small fishing lodge, myself and my wife run it, and we're pretty much busy from early spring right through into November. It's a job I'm very proud and happy to do, and something I intend to do for quite a bit longer anyway.
Fantastic. It sounds like a really interesting job. So you spend a lot of time out on the rivers and lakes in the area. I know you mentioned you do some sea fishing as well. What are like the main species that you take people out for? Is there specific ones within the area, or are there specific ones that people come to this area for?
Well, salmon and sea trout, I suppose, would be the main ones that people have been coming here for at least 150 years, I think, to fish for. Brown trout as well, I think, are quite popular. The Arctic char, although beautiful, don't really attract too many anglers. All the people would be interested in them. And the pearl mussels, no, not really. But yeah, salmon and sea trout go back, at least 150 years. We still have quite a good stock of salmon. Our sea trout stock is under pressure and has been for the last 20 or so years, for a variety of reasons, some of which we don't know. Links to possible salmon farming and stuff like that. We're not sure yet. The jury's still out on that, but we are struggling a bit. There are some issues with salmon as well, but we still locally I fish the River Inny. It still would have, by European standards, quite a healthy stock of salmon. It's quite common to catch salmon. It's you would expect most days you go fishing for people to catch, which is a very good thing. The brown trout stock is pretty healthy, but like I say, the sea trout has been a problem now and been declining significantly for the last 20 years, which is a real shame, because I think that was what the area was. I mean, the sea trout fishing in the Lough Catchment was some of the best lake fishing for sea trout in Europe. Only when I started, as recently as 25 years ago, and sadly that's slipping away. And we keep hoping that things will turn around, but we're not sure they will.
It sounds like a pretty dire story, really, with the number of the salmon and sea trout that you're seeing, and I think that's a story that's echoed really in a lot of different places, not just specific to Cary in this area, but all over Ireland, really. Mm-hmm. And so, in your own experience in taking people out onto the river and guiding people, have you noticed changes in the habitats that you're seeing along the river? Have you noticed land use changes in the time that you've been there? And have you noticed changes in, I know you mentioned the reducing number of salmon and sea trout, have you noticed any other changes in the kind of wildlife that you're encountering on a general day?
Well, I mean, I suppose I have seen maybe a little more intensive farming. I mean, we're lucky enough around here, most of the land isn't intensively farmed. There's been a bit of an increase in forestry, which probably started just around the time I arrived here. There were some new plantations of spruce, which aren't really good for salmonids. But yeah, by and large, not major changes in agricultural use, but I have seen a change, sort of climate-based or weather-based change, bigger floods, historically bigger than we've ever known before, that have changed the habitat, changed the rivers themselves have changed and moved, and longer dry spells, which so far haven't affected the juvenile fish so much. They haven't, but we're getting close to a point where we may see deaths to juvenile fish. I think this summer was particularly hot, but we're still doing okay. I think we're not too bad on that, but we're getting close to it, to a point where it may get too hot in the summer. Those warm summers, while they affect the river, they also affect the lakes. A lot of the salmon, when they go into the lakes, if the water's too hot, they just, they're not interested in our flies or our lures or whatever. They go down into the deep, colder parts, and we don't catch them. So that's not, as an angling guide, that's not good. We want our typical sort of Irish cool, wet summers, and we're not seeing much. It's nice to see the sunshine. It's not ideal. As an angling guide, we want more normal weather, I think, and we haven't seen as much of that as we were used to in the past.
So you're like the opposite to everyone else, praying for sunshine. You're praying for the nice soft days where it's a little bit cooler.
Yeah, when our anglers arrive, particularly the salmon and sea trout anglers, they're doing their rain dances and hoping to see clouds over the mountains and stuff. So they think it's bad weather if it's beautiful and sunny and warm. So yeah, it's a little bit different, but I can understand, as somebody who lives here all the time, that a little bit of sunshine is nice too. We don't want all the rain, but a certain amount of it is very important.
So thinking about the kinds of people that you have that are coming doing their rain dances, have you noticed like a big change in the people that are coming to go guiding with you? And have you noticed, like, is there a lot of young people? Is it mostly older people? Is there a certain demographic? Is there a certain country really that you see a lot of visitors from?
I think historically here our market would have been the UK. Because they were used to salmon and sea trout fishing. It was a species that they already had, but we had more, so they came here. I think we're now seeing more Europeans than we did. The age profile, probably, we don't get many customers under the age of 40. You sometimes get fathers with their sons, but not too many, and some of them are getting a little older. But we're also seeing people that not as well off as they used to be. I mean, in the past, to hire a guide for a week was quite expensive in comparison to what you earned. These days, people earn more money, so you don't have to be a wealthy person. I mean, there was a tradition in this part of Ireland of, it's a wealthy people hiring a guide for a whole month, and they would move from rivers to lakes to, around the whole peninsula and beyond. Now people come for 2 days, 3 days at a time on a fishing holiday, and then head back to Switzerland or back to France or whatever. I don't think that wasn't there 50 years ago. So it's shorter stays, and not so many wealthy people. I think young people as well, some young people, but not as young as we like. We want to see more young people.
Try and get more kids out there angling is the goal, is it?
Yeah, and I mean, we still, despite the fact as a guide, I might complain about some things, we still have a lot of fish. I mean, it's, we were fishing on Loch Derriana, which was mentioned earlier yesterday, and, we caught maybe 50 trout, I suppose, maybe more actually, I can't quite remember, in a day's fishing. So it's, it's quite a common thing to catch fish. We were salmon fishing earlier in the week. We had three salmon between 4 anglers for a day, which wasn't bad. I was happy. That would be a good return anywhere really in Western Europe as well. So we still have a lot. We have a lot to hold on to, and we've got a lot that we should protect. We haven't lost it yet. We still have it, so it's worth holding on to.
Fantastic. So what advice would you give to someone who's wanting to maybe try angling or get into it for their first time, or who doesn't have much experience? Is the advice hire a guide and learn from someone, or is there clubs you can join? What's the best way?
I suppose I would say hire a guide because it's my job. But in fairness, there is an awful lot of information out there on things like YouTube. There's books you can get, and many people started by reading books. I mean, YouTube now is so good. You can go on there and learn how to to fly fish or even lure fish. And we're lucky also. There's a lot of access on the whole peninsula, the whole Iveragh Peninsula, to free fishing. Lots of lakes where you can go fish for free or for a very small fee. So while yes, it is useful to have a guide to start with, both to help you catch more fish and to stay safe, there's a lot of opportunities for people, and even families to go fishing where they can and will catch fish. Without spending too much money, as part of their week's holidays, they can spend a day on a lake or on the bank of a river and have an opportunity to catch fish and enjoy the whole surrounding. And it is a beautiful place to be, and we're surrounded by some beautiful things. I mean, just today we were out fishing and watching an osprey circling around and looking for food, which is quite a privilege. So
it sounds amazing, yeah.
Yeah, it's not just catching fish. I mean, it is nice to catch fish. We actually today, the group of anglers we had a little bit of a slow day. We caught some fish, but not as many as maybe we expected. But we spent an hour watching an osprey, and then we had pilot whales beside us when we were fishing on the sea in the afternoon. So and they were very happy with their day. So there is more to fishing than catching fish.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's amazing to be able to get the opportunity to see species like that as well when you're out for one thing and then getting a whole other experience with pilot whales and ospreys. Sounds like a fantastic day.
It was a good
Is
day.
there somewhere you'd recommend people going for advice on, say, like fishing licenses or tags or anything like that? Where's the best place to find that kind of information?
I think that in the IFI, the Inland Fisheries Ireland website's very good. So, if you want to fish for salmon or sea trout, you need a license. And there are lots of places. I mean, locally, we have a local shop in Waterville that will, supply your needs there, but it's quite easy to do. But I think if people are starting, you want to start with brown trout, because they are much more plentiful and much easier to catch. So then work your way up. So it's probably best not to start with salmon or sea trout. That's something you need to work your way up to, I think. But yeah, there's a lot. The IFI, the Inland Fisheries Ireland website, there's a load of information on all the different catchments and systems, fishing areas in the whole peninsula that'll help people. And lots of good free advice. Even when you buy your salmon license, you get a booklet that tells you all about fishing and where to fish. So all that's very useful and free.
Fantastic. That's really great. Thank you so much, John, for joining us and sharing your information. I think it's great to have someone like you on who's on the ground every day and out there on the rivers and lakes. And I think there's a lot of valuable knowledge in that kind of like hands-on experience as well. So thank you so much for being with us this evening and sharing that.
Pleasure.
And I'd like to invite Noe on now, who is going to share some of his PhD research with us. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm glad you made it in time. I know you were held up earlier, so I really appreciate you coming on.
No, thank you.
If anyone has any questions, you could type them into the Q&A, and while we try and troubleshoot with the noise sound there, we could answer a few. I did have one question there that I think kind of popped into my head as all the speakers sort of came together with their talks. About sort of single species conservation, like how concerned or how much of a concern is it to be looking at single species like salmon or trout in terms of conservation, or is it more important to be looking at like water quality or pearl mussels in particular in terms of water quality?
Will I jump in there?
Do, yeah.
I found those talks really interesting. Noah, come on, get yourself together there. There's some good, you've got some good stuff to show people. I
know, even better now.
Still a bit of interference.
Yeah.
So Eleanor, to answer your question, I mean, ideally a holistic approach, but if you, this is my own personal opinion. I'm working on life projects. This is the approach that we took in Duhallow and looking at trying to protect pearl mussels on there, which is it's a challenge, as Stephen will tell you, and we were dealing with mixed farming and a lot of human population densities and that and a pearl mussel population that was not in as good condition as the ones that Stephen has talked about. But I mean, we took the view that even if we couldn't save the pearl mussels, and we weren't naive, we said, look, at least if we aim for that ambition and try that, they were raising the bar. So at least if you're trying there, you may not get there, but it'll rise all the other boats along the way. So the salmon will benefit, the other macrovertebrates will benefit, the other species. So I think it's the way to go, and it's a great way to focus people's minds. If everything becomes just biodiversity, well, you have biodiversity in a town. It could be daisies and dandelions, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong, but you do have unique stuff then in Cary and Donegal and everywhere really, that you do have to have that focus on, what's special. I mean, like what John described there, the fish trip today, I mean, fantastic. You're not going to get that in Clonmel. I'm in Clonmel. You'll get other stuff. I mean, you got River Shewer and some really good, nice stuff there, and you go to the mountains, you'll see ravens, you won't see ospreys. Well, maybe you will in time. Fish are a bit small. But, so I do think that to have that kind of, you need to have a few flagship species, because human beings, where we are, we like to have kind of, cool stuff to identify with, and that's just the way we are. Why do people spend loads of money on tigers and stuff that's cuddly? Pearl mussels are harder. I guess Stephen will tell you this, it's harder to get you excited about a pearl mussel that lives to 130 years. It doesn't do a whole pile. From our perspective, yet its life cycle is far more fascinating than a tiger when you think about it. So yeah, I think it's to try and have that mix, but not design all your conservation measures so you're only helping one species. So for example, traditionally in fisheries, we would have looked at salmon, and then the focus would be on, we'll try and generate salmon. and not take into account, for example, lampreys or other species, and put in spawning grounds and weirs for salmon. So and that the way we're going now with the water framework directive, it is a more holistic approach to looking at the hydrology and the hydromorphology and all that. But still, I'm of the view, if you want to engage the public, having a few iconic species is a great way to get people excited and engaged.
Yeah, that's some great points made there, Fran. I mean, the pearl mussel, I suppose if we do manage to get any success with the pearl mussel, it does raise all boats, like in all the aquatic species come along with that, salmon and trout and mackerel invertebrates and all that. But I suppose what comes up a lot at farmer training and farmer meetings and individual meetings and group meetings, I suppose when you're talking to a bunch of farmers, and even if a plot isn't scoring that well for one reason or another, maybe for the reason because it has a lot of historical drainage or something like that, it's trying to get that message out there that even though you're 500 meters or a kilometer away from the main river, that this wet ground, that this flush, this wet grassland has a function, and to give that a value. And for that takes a bit of thinking, like, because I suppose our grandfathers and great grandfathers, we were forever improving the land and draining the land and making it more productive. So we kind of have to do the opposite of what we've always done as a species, and I suppose our great grandfathers, what they might do in a lifetime, we could probably do in a week or 2 weeks at the moment with the machinery that's available, I suppose. And that is the biggest threat, and I suppose the Pearl Mussel project is a voluntary project as far as up to the farmer if they want to join or not, so there are, there's always that debate about the carrot and the stick. So what we really try to use the carrot approach and get the information out there and try and get people to be proud, I suppose, of the fact that, as I mentioned in the presentation down in Cary, like that we have such a strong population of pearl mussels, but that we can't take that for granted, because if we don't improve matters, we won't have that strong population for much longer. The recruitment isn't happening, and hopefully the Pearl Mussel project will improve things. But I suppose in this kind of in the context of the Pearl Mussel and what's happening, 5 years is a very, very short time. You probably need to be talking 15 or 20 years before you see differences on the ground, like if you see it's very hard to detect improvement in recruiting in such a short pace of time. But I suppose we use the land as a surrogate. So if you have blanket bogs that are functioning properly and wet grasslands that are functioning properly and flushes, it should transfer over properly positively into the aquatic environment as well.
So, Stephen, earlier when you were talking about the project length, that was something I was actually going to ask about, like, and I suppose this applies to the work of Breda and Fran as well. Is how much of a concern is the time frame that you are planning for? If your project timeline is only 5 years, but like you say, you'd really need maybe 15 to 20 years to be able to tell the recruitment.
I suppose the results-based approach, which I don't know if I explained it very well, but that the farmer gets paid for protecting the habitats and enhancing the habitats. That results-based approach, which is being used across a lot of the EIPs, the Hen Harrier project, and I suppose historically the Burn project for quite a number of years at this point. So the Department of Agriculture, I think, will incorporate that results-based approach. So we'd be hoping that the agri-environmental schemes that the department run directly through the department would have that results-based element, and that it wouldn't be one that these areas of high nature valued areas would have a special status within the main frame. That I suppose whether or not the Pearl Mussel project will be extended, I don't know, but definitely it would be a real shame, I suppose, after 5 years of gathering all that data, that basically advice is going out each year. So in the first year, you get a very good baseline data from each farm and what's there and how it's functioning. And I suppose over the 5 years, you we'd be hoping at the end of it that you'd have an awful lot of information there. So it would be a shame, I suppose, that if that wasn't used going forward. I'm sure it will be in some shape or form. But I think definitely that results-based approach will be will be used by the Department of Agriculture in some shape or form from 2023 on, I imagine, hopefully anyway. Fingers
Excellent.
crossed.
Yeah, it would be great to see it carried forward. So, Noe, we can see your screen now. So, thanks so much for sticking with us with the technology.
No, that's great. Yeah.
You're very welcome. So, looking forward to hearing your research.
Thank you. So yeah, so I'm Noé Barthelemy. I'm still a PhD student with Paolo Prodel, Rosalind Hines, and George Hutchinson, who are my supervisors back in Belfast. I'm now back in France to work on the writing and the analysis of the PhD, and so I've not been talking English for a while. So please don't hesitate to interrupt if anything is unclear. So yeah, let's go ahead. So the title of the PhD is about taxonomy and phylogeography of the Arctic char in Ireland. So I'm gonna go straight to the sampling. Basically, we have some nearly 3,000 samples from all the populations of chars that are still living in Ireland. As you can see, they are mostly located on the west of Ireland, and they've been collected like mostly in the early days by the ICCG, thanks to Fran and his colleagues. So thanks again for that. And the rest has been collected also by the AFI in the most recent years. So as you can see, also a lot of populations are extinct, mainly in the center of Ireland and in the east. Now, I also have some samples from outgroup populations, that is from England, from Scotland, but also some from Finland, because my studies are mostly population genetics. So in population genetics, you need to have outgroup populations in order to have something to be compared with. My objectives are first to reevaluate the taxonomy of char in Ireland. I'm gonna come to that just after. And then that is done by examining their phylogeographic history. That is the way the genetic lineages spread into a geographic space through time. I'm also going to investigate the existence of potential sympatric populations because there is no formal published evidence of sympatric populations in Ireland, which is a bit surprising because there's plenty of populations in sympatries that have been described in Scotland, for example. Yeah, and so a sympatric population, by the way, is one or two or more populations living in the same geographic space, but not interbreeding together that much. I'm also doing some geometric morphometric analysis, which is a way, it's a sort of fancy way to analyze pictures of fish in order to detect statistical differences in their shape. And from that, infer maybe differences between them that may come from genetic differences or not. And finally, I'm doing also some environmental economics with George Hutchinson, and the goal of that aspect of my project is to assess how policymakers deal with the conservation of char populations in Ireland, in particularly when they have different levels of threat and how they prioritize different populations in different contexts. So about the taxonomy of char in Ireland, it's it's quite a good one. I mean, char as a species in the world has been very confused in terms of taxonomy because, as you surely know, they are very diverse morphologically. And so in the past centuries, the first taxonomies didn't have any genetic tools to separate species. And so they did everything based on morphological characters. And they didn't use always the same morphological characters. So there's been a bit of a chaos. And in Ireland, there's been 6 species described: Salvelinus obtusus, Colli, Grayi, Fimbriatus, Scharfi, and Trevelyanni, by Gunther and Regan. But this taxonomy, because it was based on inconsistent morphological character, has been acknowledged as outdated, and thus all the species of char in Ireland, but also in the world, pretty much, have been gathered into a species complex called Salvelinus alpinus. But as you can imagine, the Salvelinus alpinus species complex doesn't reflect all the diversity that is present in char populations, and so that's why it needs to be investigated on a local scale, and so that diversity on a local scale is acknowledged and thus protected. So to do that, I started by collecting genetic data. So this is a bit of some technicality, but I collected a few different data sets that gives me different type of information about their genome. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. About the geometric morphometric analysis, we got quite a lot of pictures, also thanks to the ICCG and the IFI. That is 476 pictures from 20 different lakes. And the idea is to combine the data coming from the pictures with data coming from the genetics. I didn't do that yet in my project. It's just about to happen. But so basically what you do is that I hope that you can see those small orange circles everywhere on that fish. So those are called landmarks. And you place them in specific places on the fish that are meaningful. You can see there's 1 on each fin. There's 4 on the eyes. There's a few on the mouth, 1 on the operculum, etc., etc. And from that, you can see how the shape differ between different fish. And so you can see here on the left a list of populations. So I don't expect that you know where those populations come from, but basically they come from all across the west of Ireland. And if you look at the plot on the right, this plot is a PCA. So you can see basically how based on the variation of shape of the fish, you can discriminate populations from each other. And as you can see on the plot, you can't really, here they're all a bit mixed together and there's no clear distinction based on shape at this stage of the analysis. But if you look at the main axes of variance that are on the Y and on the X axis, you can basically look at how the shape varies. And here, the grids you can see they are deformated where the variation is happening. So the blue one on the left, you can see that there's a lot of variation on the head of the fish, and on the right, you can see that there's a lot of variation on the length of the fish too. And similarly on the other major axis of variation, you can see there's like a big difference in the caudal peduncle and the length of the fish too. So that doesn't give, it's still the early stage of this analysis. So I'm still investigating a lot of things about that, but basically it tells you that it's hard to discriminate populations apart, but throughout all the populations, there's main differences that occur mainly in those areas of the morphology of the fish. Now, I did a lot more of investigation on the genetics yet, so I'm going to be able to talk a lot more precisely about this. What you can see here is I'm just going to grab a map. So I hope you can see the map on the top right of the picture here. Basically, all the points you see with different shapes and colors are the populations I could include in my genetic analysis yet. So as you can see, there's a lot of them in the north and a lot of them in the south in County Cary, and a few in the middle. Basically, when I looked at the genetic diversity of those populations, I knew that there was lakes of different sizes, small lakes, big lakes, etc. And the first thing I wanted to look at was the allelic richness, which is an estimator of the genetic diversity of the populations. And also at the population size, which is NE, the last column on the right here. The effective population size is also like a measure of the population size itself. So if you can see the numbers, you can see that they vary quite a lot. They vary from 40 to several hundreds. And that is quite helpful when you want to prioritize population for conservation, because a population that has both a small population size and low genetic diversity is a population that is likely at risk to go extinct. In turn, a population with a big population size and a lot of genetic diversity is probably much more healthy and thus less likely to go extinct. So now I wanted to look at the patterns between those variables, and I saw that there was a strong correlation between the genetic diversity and the area of the lake. So bigger the lake, more diverse the population on a genetic standpoint. But there was no correlation between the size of the population and the size of the lake, which is quite surprising. You would expect that a bigger lake would host a bigger population, but not really. And also, there's no correlation between the genetic diversity and the size of the population, which is also unexpected because you would expect a big population to have a high genetic diversity. And so far, my hypothesis is that when the char invaded Ireland after the last ice age, I saw that Fran talked a little bit about that. I had a view on his PDF. So after the ice age, the populations of char invaded Ireland, and probably were without any competitors, and they invaded lakes that were pretty much empty. So the idea is that they invaded those lakes, and back then probably their genetic diversity was linked with the size of the population, and the size of population was linked to the size of the lake, because the lake was empty and full of opportunities for a fish like char. But then competitors came on the way, like trout and other fish, and probably pushed char population to the bottom of the lake in the deepest areas. And that could explain why some big lakes have small populations, and why those correlations are basically broken nowadays. Now, when you look at the relationships of those populations on a genetic standpoint, here's what you can see. Here is another PCA, but with genetic data. So there's no need to look for an X and a Y axis The idea here is that populations are into a little circle here, and the further the populations are apart, the more different they are on a genetic standpoint. So as you can see, for example, the VAG and the Glen populations, which are both in the north. If you can see on the zoom on the map, it's very little on my screen because I'm on the phone, but oops, sorry. They are both in the same catchment and they are linked by a river. And it is possible, but unexpected, that there is some connection between those two populations, that is some char going into the other lake. It hasn't been observed to my knowledge yet, but the genetic data suggests that those populations are very close together. And because they are also close together on a geographic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Then you can see in the red cycle on the bottom of this picture that you have a lot of populations that are Kumasahan, Kumaglashlo, Clun, Karag. All those populations are in the south here of Ireland, and they are close together genetically, so it makes sense. But close to them, you can also see the population of Fad, the population of Kindrum, and the population of Altan. Those populations are not in the south at all, they are in the north. So does it make sense, yes or no? Well, that's why I did multiple different types of analysis. So that's another plot. Here, what you can see is another representation of how the genetic data can tell populations apart, right? And what you can see immediately here is that basically one color will sort of represent one population. And you can see that Viag and Glen, again, are together, they have the exact same color. And Clun and Karag, which are both in the south and in the same catchment too, have the same color. So far, geography matches with the population genetics. If you basically, to understand why northern populations could be close genetically from southern populations, you need to have a certain idea of how the phylogeography of char in Ireland happened. So the idea is that after the Ice Age, there was a few glacial refugium across around Ireland. So maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No one knows really. There's some research on it, but mostly hypothesis. And if you imagine a simple scenario, you would expect the plot I showed you just before to look like that. That is, if a northern population is coming from a northern refugium and a southern population coming from southern refugium, then you would see maybe that they will mix together somewhere in the south of Ireland, and this would be an admixture zone. That's the way it's called in genetics. That is a zone where two different genetic lineages mix with each other, but that at the two extremes of the island, you should expect some purest genetic lineages. That is pure north in the north and pure south in the south. And that's not what we see. As I told you, we see northern populations that are closer to the southern and vice versa. And that's probably because there was a lot of glacial refugia and the fish went like all the way north, south, east, west, and making it very difficult to understand the phylogeographic history of char in Ireland. It is also likely that the different lakes of Ireland were not formed at the same time. That is, some lakes are very close together geographically, but they are very far apart in terms of date of creation, simply because the ice didn't retreat at the same pace at different areas of the island. Now, so that was a zoom on the catchments. So as you can see in Cary here, you have Cwm Cwm you have Carrag, Clun, and Accws in the same catchment. And you can see that Clun and Carrag on the plot have the same color. So again, they are genetically very close. That makes sense. But then you may ask why Accws is in green and doesn't have the same color. Well, that can be explained because sometimes a population may be smaller, like a small population living in the lake of Accws. And the smaller the population, the higher the genetic drift. Genetic drift in population genetics is one of the main forces, like natural selection is one. And genetic drift does that small populations tend to lose genetic diversity just randomly with time. And it's a process that cannot be stopped except by gene flow. So if there's other fish coming from another lake, they can bring more diversity in that small population and thus maintain a certain level of genetic diversity. If there's no gene flow, that is, if there's a dam, if there's a waterfall, if there's who knows what, the fish cannot go into that small lake and the small population starts to drift. And with genetic drift, we'll end up being very different genetically, while the population was probably originating from the same ancestors. And that's why here the population of Accws may seem as very differentiated from its two neighboring populations. Another way to look at this, and a quite usual way actually, is to look at it on a phylogenetic tree. So I suppose you're quite familiar with those trees. Basically, the populations are each on a branch, and the length of the branch represents the genetic distance they have with each other. And as you can see here, you have a big group in the south, which I call the Cary group. But as we've seen on the first plot, this group of population is composed of a lot of population from the south, so Carrag, Clun, Cwm and Accws, but also Kindrum, Greenan, Fad, which are all northern populations. So again, this is quite surprising, but because all the analysis I performed agree with each other and they always group the same populations with each other, this probably means that they have some degree of genetic relationship and thus disagree with a simple scenario of a colonization from the north and the south. It's more complicated, probably a lot of different colonization waves all across Ireland and at different times. And another tree saying basically the same thing. You can see the same grouping. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but I'm sure you got the idea. You'll notice here that contrary to a phylogenetic tree where species are separated by a large branch distance, for example, if you look at the tree of great apes, you could see that the chimpanzee and the man are very differentiated and there's like a large genetic distance between them. It's not the case with char populations because they are so young. So they all branch to the middle of the tree and none of them is very differentiated. If you look at the population called Gill PCRV. It's the one in gray on the middle of the bottom. That is a Finnish population. And you can see that that population from Finland is not even that differentiated from the others, which tells a lot about how young those populations are and how not differentiated they are just because of their young age. Now, an important consideration is to go back to the taxonomy of the species and to see if the species that were described by Gunther and Regan made sense, and do they make sense in the light of this new genetic data? And so far, I think they don't. You can see some of these populations were representatives of the ancient, the old species, basically. So you can see Salvelinus colli, Grayi, Obtusus, and Fimbriatus. And it appears that they are not more differentiated than the other populations. So this description was purely made on morphological characters, but is not backed up by genetic data. Thus, that means that there's a very big challenge because a lot of people have been bringing documentation on the morphology of char and how different they are from each other. And these differences need to be protected and need to be conserved by the state. But to do that, we need a way to give them a name. If not a species name, we need a way to protect local populations in an effective way and in a way that acknowledge that great diversity that char have in Ireland and elsewhere in the world. Actually, it's quite of a global issue. So yeah, that's it. I think. I hope I was a bit long, but
fantastic, Noé. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think the genetics research that's done at the moment is so fascinating, particularly when you put it in the context of how we were naming things, 50 or 100 years ago, and then using these new skills and new technologies to reassess those relationships and see how it all fits together. It's quite fascinating. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your research. And thank you to everyone who has listened in this evening. We've run quite a bit over time, so apologies for that. My timekeeping is always terrible. But thank you all for sticking with us. We have recorded the session, so I will be adding it to the channel, Kerry Biosphere, so you can watch back again or share it with anyone you think may be interested. We haven't had any questions come in the Q&A, and since I've kept all the speakers here so much longer, I would like to finish up for the evening. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone for coming in and joining us and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. And I do hope to invite you all back again sometime in the not too distant future to be able to share even more of your research and learn even more of these amazing facts that you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Eleanor.
Thanks, Eleanor.
See you guys.
And thanks
See you,
everyone.
folks.
Yeah, good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.